The following short story, A Touch of the Ruthless, is an original composition that I wrote for an online short story competition in 2021. The rules of the competition limited the story to 2,000 words, stated that it had to be dystopian or post-apocalyptic in nature, and also required that it had to have something to do with a gold locket. Beyond that, writers were allowed to indulge themselves, and this is what I came up with. I hope you'll enjoy it. A Touch of the Ruthless. The mystery of human existence lies not in just staying alive, but in finding something to live for. Dostoevsky, The Brothers Karamazov. Tear-falling pity dwells not in this eye. Shakespeare, Richard III. You again, Ellen said. About 60 yards away, in a tall pine to her right, perched on a white, gnarled branch that poked upward like a broken bone, a hawk sat watching her. The bird was a beautiful bronze color, with tinges of blue in the tips of its coppery wings. It stared fixedly at her in the morning quiet. The bird had first appeared about 2 weeks ago. Sarah, Ellen's younger sister, had seen it first. They had just returned to their shelter from an afternoon of foraging and were getting ready to go down the ladder when Sarah had tugged at Ellen's coat, pointed and said, "Oh, look at that bird. Isn't it pretty?" "It's a hawk," Ellen had replied matter-of-factly. And then, because Sarah was so delighted with it, she added, "Yes, it is pretty." Something about the bird had troubled Ellen from the start. Unlike other hawks she had seen, which were always bobbing nervously about on their clawed feet, tilting their heads and lifting their wings, this one rarely moved. It merely sat and watched as Ellen and Sarah went back and forth, to and from their shelter. This had been unnerving enough, even if apparently harmless, but over the last few days things had changed. The hawk had begun to follow them on their journeys, always staying about 50 to 60 yards away, always quietly watching. "What do you think she wants?" Sarah had asked yesterday afternoon when they went into the forest to gather firewood for the night. "How do you know it's a she?" Ellen asked. "Most brightly colored birds are males." "How come the boy birds get to be the pretty ones?" Sarah asked with a frown. Then, just as quickly, she brightened. "Maybe she's just lonely and she likes us." "Maybe," Ellen replied, casting a wary look over her shoulder. Now, as she stood locked in a staring contest with the hawk, she finally realized what it was that had made her so uncomfortable from the beginning. "You're losing your fear, aren't you?" she said to the bird. Dad had told her that most wild animals were no real threat because they were scared of humans and would usually run away, unless you came upon them suddenly and startled them, or else made them feel threatened in some way. "It's when they don't run off that you've got a problem," he had said. "When they've lost their fear, that's when you're in trouble." Like everything else in the world, the hawk was hungry, and evidently growing bolder in its desperation. It couldn't kill them outright, of course, but its strong hooked beak and razor-like talons could inflict serious injuries, and those could kill them. Since Sarah was the smaller of the two girls, it would likely go for her when it finally made its move, and Sarah was never as watchful as she should be. Too bad, Ellen thought. It really is a beautiful bird. She raised and shouldered her rifle in one smooth movement. Peering through the weapon's scope, she centered the crosshairs on the hawk's broad chest, drew in a breath of the wintry air, and calmly squeezed the trigger. The shot blew the hawk backward. It flipped and tumbled lifelessly through the pine boughs with its wings outspread, as if doing a terrible kind of cartwheel, and was lost to sight. "Ellen?" She looked down to see Sarah standing at the bottom of the ladder that led into their shelter. Her face was a pale, frightened oval in the shadows. "It's okay," Ellen said, lowering her rifle. "I was just practicing my aim. Are you ready?" "Uh-huh." "Do you have it?" Sarah unzipped the top of her coat. A gold, heart-shaped locket hung from a chain around her neck. In spite of the heavy overcast, it shone brightly against the dark blue sweater she wore beneath her coat. Ellen nodded. "Okay, come on up." She stepped aside as Sarah climbed up the ladder. Together they pushed clumps of dead, dry brush together to cover the entrance. Then Sarah straightened and smiled, snapping her sister a salute with one gloved hand. "Ready to go," she said, her cheeks already beginning to flush in the cold air. Between her smile and flushed cheeks, she seemed to glow. Ellen couldn't help but smile back. "Okay, Puts," she said, slinging the rifle behind her back and working her arm through the strap. Sarah's eyes, as blue as the sky had once been, narrowed. Her mouth quirked in her frown. "Only Daddy calls me Puds," she said in a low voice, suddenly close to tears. Ellen's mother had called Sarah Puddin. Predictably, her dad had shortened that to Puds. It was his personal pet name for her, just as Ellen's had once been Elle. Ellen blew out a long, suffering sigh. "You're even starting to think like him." Then she pulled Sarah's gray woolen cap down over the tops of her ears. "You're right. I'm sorry." Sarah smiled again, caught Ellen by the hand, and started off in the direction of the forest, tugging Ellen along with her. "Come on, sissy, let's go!" Ellen fell in behind her, casting one last glance back at where the hawk had fallen. 2 years ago, a thing like killing the bird would have reduced her to hysteria if she'd been able to do it at all. She'd been her mother's clone in those days, her world consisting of drama class, designer clothes, monthly hair appointments, and helping out at Mom's magazine when the opportunity presented itself. She had loved her father, but they'd had nothing in common. Sarah had been Daddy's girl. But that was all back before the sky split open and rained fire on the earth, lifting dust high into the atmosphere, turning summer into winter and winter into something that tried very hard to kill you. Ellen's father had taken his family and fled the city, where things were quickly becoming, in his words, medieval. Ellen had been 14 at the time and had thought herself so grown up, but she had been more of a child than she'd ever realized. This fact was driven home for Ellen in the cruelest possible way, by the death of her mother at the hands of an armed mob, just as they were on the verge of finally escaping the city. Sarah had been 9 at the time and was now 11. She was still very much a child herself, but then she probably always would be. They'd known she was different even before the world changed. "She's always going to face learning challenges," her teachers and therapists had said, "but she's the sweetest little thing." They tramped over frozen pine needles and hard-packed ground for about 20 minutes, their breath puffing out in icy little clouds ahead of them, the crunching of their footsteps the only sound to be heard, before they finally reached the clearing and Sarah's special rock. It was a mossy, flat-topped boulder protruding from the mountainside, with a hollow underneath that usually remained free from snow. Ellen held Sarah back within the tree line for a moment until she was satisfied that all was well and they were alone. At last she nodded to Sarah and said, "Okay, let's go." Sarah ran out ahead of her and knelt down in the snow beside the boulder. She took her cap off, slipped the locket over her head, kissed it gently, and placed it as far beneath the rock as she could reach. Then she stood, brushing snow from the knees of her jeans, and wiped her red nose with the back of her glove. "How long do you think?" "Better give it about 2 days," Ellen said. "It's been colder lately." Sarah looked down at the snow and shuffled her feet. "So long," she said quietly. Ellen felt something clench in the back of her throat. "It'll pass before you know it," she said, hoping Sarah would think the rasp in her voice was from the cold. Then she smiled as brightly as she could and held out her hand. "Want to go back and throw the frisbee?" Sarah grinned and clapped enthusiastically. She loved games of almost any kind, and they always helped to make the lonely days pass more quickly. On the way back, they gathered firewood, and Ellen did the funny voices that she knew would make Sarah laugh. Then they threw the frisbee for a while, but not long today because it was just too cold. "We'll go back inside and play board games instead," Ellen said as they cleared the entrance to the shelter. "Mousetrap?" Sarah asked with wide, hopeful eyes. "Sure." Their shelter was nothing short of a miracle. A National Guard tractor-trailer that had been washed off of the highway in a flood when a dam or a lake bed had burst somewhere nearby. Maybe a fragment of the comet hit somewhere around here, Dad had speculated when they first found the truck, now almost completely buried in the cold mud of the valley. Dad had broken into it with a pickaxe and put a makeshift ladder together so that they could get down into it. The trailer had been filled with supplies, mostly canned goods, but some clothing and assorted other items as well, such as batteries. It was underground, out of the wind, and easily heated by a small stove Dad had fashioned from metal and dried mud. He had been both an outdoorsman and a craftsman. Other vehicles were also buried in the valley, and they had proven to be a rich source of supplies as well. People had fled the cities with all sorts of things they thought they might need when the disaster hit: food, clothing, blankets, first aid kits, and also firearms like Ellen's rifle. Taking these things felt a little like grave robbing to Ellen, but it was keeping them alive. Ellen and Sarah played a few games of mousetrap by fire and lantern light in the afternoon. Then they had a lunch of MREs from the supply stash. Afterward, Ellen read to Sarah from one of the few books Dad had let her carry in her backpack when they left the city, The Giving Tree, and finally said that they needed to take a nap. When they were huddled beneath their blankets, listening to the snap and pop of the fire, Sarah asked, as she always did when they went to sleep, "When will Daddy be back?" Ellen smoothed Sarah's hair back, put her arm around her, and said in reply, as she always did, "When the sky is blue and the light feels warm again." "You lie so easily now," she thought, "just like you kill and rob the valley tombs." A touch of the ruthless, Dad had called it. You do what it takes to survive. "How do you keep from turning into a monster?" Ellen had asked him. "You do it for love," he had said. "Love is ruthless that way sometimes." So Ellen killed, and she lied, and she robbed the dead for the love of her sister. When she was sure Sarah was asleep, she would get up and go back to the special rock in the forest. She would get the locket and read the note Sarah had written to Dad and placed inside it. It was one of their special things, the locket. Back before the world had gone dark, they used to take turns writing little notes to one another and hiding the locket around the house. The day that Dad had fallen and broken his back in the valley and died with his head in Ellen's lap, she had come back to the shelter and told Sarah that he had gone to look for a town. "He has to be careful not to bring bad people back," she explained when Sarah had begun to cry. Then she had seen the locket around her sister's neck. "You can write him notes, though, like you used to do, remember? And he can write you back." And so, once a week, they went to the rock and Sarah left her locket with a note. Then Ellen would return by herself, read the note, and leave a reply. Sarah kept all of the notes under her pillow and read each one daily. "You have to be the parent now," Dad had said when the end came. "Don't just protect her. Don't just teach her. Love her, Ellen. Love her." "Tell me again, Ellen," Sarah murmured, nearly asleep now. "When is Daddy coming back?" "When the sky is blue," Ellen whispered, "and the light feels warm again." I hope you've enjoyed this reading of my original short story, A Touch of the Ruthless. If you have, please consider giving the video a like, consider sharing it with someone who might be interested, and subscribing to the channel if you're so inclined. Thank you very much.